We shouldn't go into occultism trying to make ourselves better out of lack. We should go into occultism to radically explore very strange experiences and grow. And that growth is going to come through tension, an alchemical tension.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we are so excited to welcome back to the podcast author, practitioner of pagan sacramental Gnosticism, and martial artist, Craig Williams. Listeners, I would definitely encourage you to listen to Craig's first appearance on the podcast. That was episode number 13, if you haven't already, where we discussed his book, Entering the Desert, Pilgrimage into the Hinterlands of the Soul, which is published by Anathema Publishing. Craig is a practitioner of Ayurvedic medicine, acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine, Vedic sciences, Gnostic spirituality, and the martial arts. Craig is also the author of Tantric Physics Volume 1, Cave of the Numinous, as we mentioned, Entering the Desert, and also The Cult of Golgotha. And in this episode, we do discuss Craig's latest book, The Cult of Golgotha, where Craig presents a mysterious and a strange glimpse into a creative occult current of Gnostic expression. Craig also touches on something that previous guests like Jason Miller and Aaron Leach have also shared, which is that ceremonial magic is a tool, and it will not solve every single problem forever for your life, especially if you are not making necessary physical and mental changes in your own life. In addition to this, we talk about Craig's workings with an explanation of terms like tantric physics and esoteric Voodoo. This book was a great read, and it was a unique confrontation of the forces of death, the elevation of consciousness, the elimination of false dichotomy thinking, and the contact with higher dimensions of existence, as well as so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Mr. Craig Williams. Craig Williams, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast today to talk about your new book.
Oh, it's an honor to be here, man. It's always a blast to talk to you, and I always appreciate your insightful questions.
Can you kind of lay out the basic premise of Cult of Golgotha? After
writing Entering the Desert, I wanted to have some type of textual representation of my work with esoteric Voodoo, but also my lifetime of magical work from a youth and kind of being involved in spiritualist churches, and then also my travels to Tibet and India and those things. And so I don't really try to separate all of that. I have distinct different experiences in my life, but they're all kind of mixing together. And then when I spent a lot of time talking with Dr. Reginald Crossley, I spoke a lot with him, and he encouraged me to write this book, and so did Michael Bertro. And so after discussions with those two gentlemen, I really thought it would be a good idea to kind of put this out. And then as I was writing it, then I could see a lot of connections to Entering the Desert as well. And I was obviously seeing a lot of connections to tantric physics. And so I wanted to kind of represent how, in my opinion, occultism should be radically creative. And I think we're losing that in today's world. We tend to see a lot of occultism become very cookie cutter and very standardized. And I think occultism, each person's practice should be, even if they're in a certain tradition, should be very individualistic. I wanted this to be my personal expression of what would happen if you had esoteric Voodoo and tantric physics and quantum physics all kind of melding together. Combine that with a lifetime of magical work. And so hopefully that shows in the book.
I remember when you came on talking about Entering the Desert and the Desert Grimoire, you really offer in that book to readers the ability of, hey, here is a template. Here is a way that you can structure your own esoteric practices and your own grimoire, and you give examples of different rituals and different preparations. But in Cult of Golgotha, as you mentioned in the book itself, there are no, or there's, very, very sparse in terms of like actually laying things out, like in Entering the Desert. Can you elaborate on that?
I wanted Entering the Desert to be a very kind of skeleton structure that people could take and insert whatever practice they were doing. Then at the end of that, I had the Desert Grimoire, which is a very strange kind of revealed text. And that kind of led me into wanting to write Cult of Golgotha. And Cult of Golgotha, I didn't want it to be any instructions on what shamans should do. I just wanted it to be, my original idea was that each chapter was going to be almost like a window into a private occult laboratory. And so that the reader could look into that chapter, and it's almost like if you were peeking into a window and seeing what was manifesting in a particular occult realm. And then hopefully that would maybe either terrify you or inspire you or something to get you to look back at what you're doing with your own magical work. The other thing was I wanted people to see that if you apply all the ideas of entering the desert, this is what can happen. And so, taking everything that I did in Entering the Desert and applying that through a lifetime of magical and occult work, or even just a glimpse of what I was able to manifest. And so I was hoping that would inspire people too, that they could see, wow, okay, this is very eclectic. This is very interesting or unique, hopefully. And then if they would do these practices, because they would have their own unique expression. It's like an artist would have their own way of painting something, or a musician their own way of writing some kind of song. So that was my idea. And then I went back through all my magical journals and just kind of tried to tie in every system that was very influential to me overall. And hopefully that shows.
One of the striking themes of Cult of Golgotha, Craig, to me, is the anti-astralness of it. Meaning, you explicitly say in the book that the body and kind of being rooted in the terrestrial sphere is not something that's neglected, but it's something that's embraced as an alchemical vehicle for transformation. And I believe you use the phrase esoteric physiology. Can you share with listeners about what is esoteric physiology?
That's an important point. I wanted this work to show that magical work, in my opinion, should be grounded in a physical body, and it needs to be grounded and connected to some type of sacred space. And that sacred space should be the sacred space of the flesh, the sacred space of the mind, but also the sacred space of the land. And so, there are certain environments that we have that connect us to certain traditions. And so I wanted to just show that although I do appreciate people's astral explorations, I think that can be sketchy very quickly. It can be cloudy. It can be confusing. And so I wanted this magical expression to be something which people could see, no, it's fundamentally based in this reality, but then it breaks open doorways into other dimensions of reality. The other thing, too, for me was this, I find it kind of strange and truly disturbing that so many people in the occult world now, they want to turn everything into a psychology. They want to say that that's not really a spirit, it's just my subconscious. And then there's a huge, just embarrassing representation of Jungian ideas in occultism. Most people haven't even read Jung at all, and so they try to maybe use some kind of Jungian ideas to wish it away into a therapist chair. But I wanted this to show that no, in my personal practice, I clearly believe in these other entities. I've communicated with them, and that I wanted to show that these communications weren't on an astral plane; they were in the flesh. That was a theme that you picked up, and I'm glad, because I think that's very important.
You and I were talking about this the last time that you were on, talking about Entering the Desert, but just for the listeners, can you kind of remind listeners, when we think of historical Gnosticism, we think of the body as a prison, and the light is seeking to divorce itself from this prison and ascend and unite with Sophia. I mean, there's so many different ways that one can think of traditional Gnosticism, but in this book, and something you really reiterate over and over again, is there is no vision of the body as being a prison. That's a false dichotomy. Can you elaborate on that?
That's one of the key ways where all of my magical work kind of manifests out of what I often say the taproot of Tantra, or the taproot of Vedic studies. And so the idea that this physical body is both like a laboratory for exploration, but it's also a sacred space. I don't believe in these transcendent fantasies that if people just, leave here, then they're going to be happy. I often refer to that as a poison, and that's a very dangerous idea in my personal opinion. My magical work is deeply grounded in my physical body, the flesh, the blood, the land, all of that comes on. Now, of course, we have limitations in the physical body. Of course, we look at practices like yoga. They're seeking to decondition the mind and transform the nervous system. And then we definitely had some traditions which were seeking to transcend the limitations of the physical body. And so then, of course, we have nuances within that discussion. One of the biggest influences in my spiritual work is Sri Aurobindo. And Sri Aurobindo has a lot of discussions about, transcending limitations of our emotions and transcending our physical limitations and our spiritual limitations. However, Aurobindo fundamentally believed that the evolution of humans and the evolution of mankind would happen in the flesh, in the body. That was one of his biggest ideas. He actually fought against typical old yogic ideas of, I need to, break out of the prison of the body, which is actually how I often have to reiterate when I say things like my Gnosticism embraces the body. My Gnosticism embraces the earth, embraces the land, embraces the flesh. I see no prison in that. I think that people who feel imprisoned in their body, if they're imprisoned in their body, then they're going to be in a lot of trouble when they enter the astral plane too. So because the flesh is actually something fairly simple to deal with. As we leave that, it becomes more subtle and more nuanced, and it can get messy very quickly. So I think we need to ground our occult practice. And so everything in the cult of Golgotha is about the flesh, the land, the blood, and the physical body.
Can you just share with the listeners, Craig, about what are the specific elements that comprise esoteric Vodun, and how does that specifically weave itself into and get applied with tantric physics?
That's a tricky area for a lot of people, because people, when they hear Vodun, they either think of Haitian Vodun or they think of African systems and things like that. But when I'm referring to esoteric Vodun in this text, it's specifically referring to the occult and magical system of Michael Bertro. I work closely with Michael and his system. It's a type of almost like a metaphysics of Vodun, which is a blend of French and Haitian esoteric practice and Martinism, theosophy, even thelemic ideas mixed in with that. So it's not just strictly Haitian. However, I was deeply influenced by Reginald Crossley, who was obviously very famous for the Voodoo Quantum Leap. However, that's just a tip of the iceberg of his writings, which I mention in the book. And so the esoteric Vodun to me is a type of magical system which obviously has some influences from Haiti, France, and also Michael Bertro's system. And so it was very inspiring to me. At the end of the day, I find Michael Bertro to be an incredibly eclectic, creative, and inspiring radical magician. And to me, Michael Bertro is everything that the modern occult system is afraid of. And that to me is very inspiring. And so Michael Bertro, just my discussions with him, my work with him, my working of his practices really inspired me to explore everything that I already knew already about Tantra, Yoga, Vedanta. It helps me kind of look back into that as well too. We can see this a lot. I mean, a lot of the American groups who are based in strictly Haitian voodoo, they're very afraid of esoteric voodoo. They're very afraid of Michael Bertro's system. They often say, we don't acknowledge any of that. And they see it as this strange demonic system of wild sex magic, which sure it can be, but it's also much more than that. There's a deeply Gnostic part of that as well, too, about self-transformation. So that's kind of colored throughout the text. And then to me, though, fundamentally, everything that I do magically, philosophically, spiritually is based in what I call tantric physics, which is my work of all the Vedic sciences. I grew up in a spiritualist church, which was theosophical based. I grew up in Louisiana in a culture immersed in hoodoo and voodoo and French Catholicism. So all those things are discolored in my mind space. And so I think that's honestly why it was so particularly easy for me to embrace Michael Bertro's system and explore it, because it's a very complicated system.
I know one of the things that you're not encouraging people to do is just, I don't need to go deep into these traditions. I can just weave them all together on the surface. That's not what you're saying, right?
No, that's a good point. And that's something that the cult of Golgotha reflects, without being dramatic, literally a lifetime of practice. It goes back from the age of 16 up until now. of all my magical work. I actually refer to that as a type of Gnostic nostalgia, where we look back on our life and we can see that our occult work often had a different timeline than our mundane life, and hopefully it was kind of interweaving in and out. And so to me, Occult of Golgotha is my manifestation of a type of Gnostic nostalgia with that too. I'm a harsh critic of what a lot of people call chaos magic, or this idea of they just cherry picking different things. I think that it's a very dangerous thing to do. If anyone might on the surface see that this book is very eclectic, if they know my body of work, then they know that I'm deeply immersed in all these different systems literally since I was a child. That's why I think, to me, it's very interesting for me to show this, that our magical work hopefully should be a reflection of our entire life. Our magical work should be a reflection of everything that we experience as a child, as an adult, everything that we read, we think. Everything, to me, is a mirror of our magical work, as opposed to this big dichotomy between this is my spiritual life, this is my magical work, this is my mundane life. Of course, we have to do that a little bit, but those are also very flimsy boundaries. You know, the idea of quantum physics, that's why I bring that in. I've always been fascinated with quantum physics, and so hopefully it shows that idea. So I think that it's about having someone, I encourage people to look back over their lives and see what they've studied a long time, see what has influenced them for a long time, and to use that to create their own. And then also, too, honestly, Michael Bertro has always asked people to create their own systems after they learned his work. I don't see a lot of people doing that. A lot of people in the Bertro system just kind of copy Bertro, or they try to explain Bertro. In constant talks with Bertro, I was like, I don't need Bertro explained to me. I just need to talk to Bertro. And then after that, I take everything I have and make my own system. I make my own grimoires. That's what we should do. That's what Michael Bertro wants people to do, to create their own systems. And so hopefully this is a representation of mine. And Michael asked me to do that. He was emphatic to please show that you're creating something which is radical and creative and trying to show people to break out of their limitations.
People just want to put everything in some kind of Freudian, Jungian kind of archetypal, very 1890s, early 1900s characterization. Yes. And I guess, Craig, in the book, you do a great job of laying out not only how that is just a flawed way of approaching esotericism, but then you go a step further, because many, many paragraphs and chapters are dedicated to this contact, and I'd love for you to talk about this, with these other beings. And can you kind of talk about what are these beings, and what was kind of the first esoteric fingerprints that you got that there were these beings out there?
To me, fundamentally, magical work should be our consciousness in the physical body attempting to communicate with other intelligences that are particularly outside of our dimension. And by doing that, just the actual interaction with them can stimulate some type of transformation. It's very important to understand that it does not mean petitioning these intelligences. It does not mean asking them for anything. What it means is literally just the fact of being in the same space with them changes them. It's very similar that if you're with a friend or a person and you feel either good with them or you feel bad with them, or a very inspirational mentor figure that just being around them inspires you to do something better. We can kind of magnify that ad infinitum when we communicate with intelligences outside of this dimension. And that's kind of based in my work with Vedic studies and Advaita Vedanta, that we were essentially, everything was an experience with the Atman, with the self. And so to me, it was very interesting. I didn't ever want some kind of magical circle where I was safe in and I was calling up something and I would control it and ask it to give me, money or, success and jobs. So frankly, to me, that's quite laughable. I mean, it's very easy to make money. It's very easy to be successful in the mundane world. You just have to work hard. And have a plan. But magical work is much different. It's working at a different level of our body, our soul, and our mind. And so to me, these intelligence, as a child, I had a large amount of what probably people would call paranormal experiences as a child. And that kind of led me into all of my occult studies. That led me into everything from exploring spiritualism to theosophy to Rudolf Steiner, then eventually to kind of finding what I would call some type of a home in studying Hinduism, and then eventually kind of going in deep in that. So I never really had a situation as a child or as a young adult where I was questioning whether something was out there. I was more about just wanting to communicate with it more because I was having experiences with it. And whether that was considered a psychotic break or something psychological, I never had any issues with that. It was never disturbing to me. I had no problem going to school and having friends and social lives and doing things, but I knew there was another level of reality into that. And so to me, as I initially started exploring Hinduism and Vedic studies, and there, of course, in Hinduism and Vedic studies, they're open to an infinite amount of dimensions, an infinite amount of intelligences. And Tantra, talks about how we live in a world of intelligences all around us, both nature spirits, but also other dimensions constantly interacting with us. So I think that, it's hard to imagine how that didn't influence every part of my occult practice, was just being grounded in Hinduism since a child. And so to me, the communication with these other entities, where these entities come from, that's the question, right? Where do they come from? I'm very comfortable with talking about interdimensional, and the inner teachings and the inner revealed teachings of Vedic sciences. They're very clear about their relationship with the planets in our solar system, within our body, other intelligences. Things like UFOs and extraterrestrial things are very normal in Vedic science. It's nothing weird. So that kind of influenced my whole life. And so to me, I was always interested in just kind of radically exploring that. And of course, when I was a young man, a young boy and teenager, and even now, I was very much interested in Aleister Crowley. And so Crowley's work was very influential to me. The evolution of humanity would come through communication with intelligences outside of our nervous system. And so to me, that's very important. Now, that's also very dangerous because it's unpredictable. And it's also, not everyone can handle it, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. It's much like, that's a very basic thing in science, that we have to push the boundaries to find new creations and things like that. And so I think that to me was the idea of this Cult of Golgotha, was just to try to inspire people to be a little bit more courageous in their magical work, to maybe be a little bit more adventurous, and to push the boundaries.
Yeah, that's definitely a theme that I know previous guests. I remember when John King was on talking about, from a ceremonial magical perspective, that people need to be bold. And
wonderful. Yes,
I know Aaron Leach and other guests have said exactly to your point that, even in the Grimoire tradition, people say, I want money. And I think it was Aaron who said, well, why don't you get a job? There's, to your point, it's being bold. And to your point too, Craig, as you mentioned, there is this potential for, if someone's not ready, if someone's not prepared, you delineate later on in the book about this kind of potential to fall into toxicity, where someone can be poisoned, and there might be this kind of negative, malignant aspect that descends upon someone's own consciousness. Can you just talk about where does that poison come from? But then what are some of the safeguards or remedies that you mention in the book, just to make sure that someone is prepared for that?
One of the themes which I do mention throughout the book is the idea of Ahrimanic concepts, which that comes clearly and distinctly from my inspiration and study of Rudolf Steiner's work. I very much see this today in today's world, that this idea of there are definitely some type of forces which are seeking to both commodify, homogenize, mechanize human consciousness. It's part of the universal growth. It's very normal. It's nothing to be that dramatic about, but it's to be expected. And I think we see that now with the obsession with secular humanism and the occultism. You can't make up anything any more hilarious than the Church of Satan saying they don't believe in Satan. It's just the best, right? The Church of Satan now is basically like a leftist social justice warrior group, as opposed to what it traditionally would have been. And so that we see that out all the time. Everyone's afraid to believe in anything, which, if someone had studied the teachings of Rudolf Steiner, it's perfectly falling into the idea of the Ahrimanic concept. And so I think that there's definitely both a mundane forces which are seeking to commodify human consciousness, to turn people into robots, to basically just make money off them, of course, but also I think on a spiritual level, there are definitely intelligences which aren't that positive. We would say the nefarious. That's normal. That's the basic of, the basic philosophy of Chinese medicine is yin and yang, Shiva, Shakti, darkness, light. These are very basic alchemical concepts. And so our dimension has that alchemy. We have to have that tension. We have to have that tension back and forth for that to work. Even within us, we have demons and we have positive forces and dark forces, and that's the combination of the two which allows us to transform. So just as we have this escapism from the flesh, we also have escapism from the shadow. And people seek to completely run away from that, and they only want to embrace only the light and ignore that. And that just creates a much more dangerous, poisonous environment as well, too. And then within that environment, so if you have a huge culture, if you have a huge mass of humanity, which is seeking to escape the darkness, that just creates a certain environment which is going to allow other forces to come in and manipulate and feed off people any way they want. And that's just how it is. So I think we have to be aware of that. So I think the fundamental way for people to be aware of that is basically to ground themselves in a traditional practice. They need to have some type of skeleton of a practice which allows them to balance themselves, have some type of ritual practice where they have a way to have some type of map to their practice, and also some way to allow themselves to clear things, to understand the dynamic of that. That was originally my idea for entering the desert, was to show that. But I think every basic occult practice has that, whether it's like a banishing ritual or an opening ritual or the middle pillar ritual or all these things. Those are things I think people need to know or experience with. But I think on a fundamental level, people right now in occultism just probably need to ground themselves in more education and more reading and more learning, and then finding mentors that can help them, and then taking their time and slowly growing too, because it's a lifetime journey. That's the thing for people to remember, that it's like if you study martial arts, if you study martial arts as a child, then you get older, then you have all these experiences to learn from, and you've had some good experiences and you had some bad experiences, and it makes you who you are. Spiritual life is no different, but once we go into the occult world and people start messing around with magic and rituals and things, then things can get really weird really quick. And I think it's very important to say that I'm not downplaying the importance of therapy or the importance of psychology. That's very important. I think the majority of people that I meet in occultism probably need a therapist more than they need a grimoire. That's totally not an insult to them. It just means they have a lot of unresolved issues. And then I ask them, why are you turning to occultism? What are you looking for out of occultism? Are you looking for power, money, success? You can get that from a Tony Robbins seminar. You don't need that from a grimoire. And so for me, occultism should be about radical spiritual transformation, radical exploration into other dimensions of consciousness, to my personal ideas. And that's what I kind of wanted that to be with the Cult of Golgotha and all of my magical work and all of my teachings to show that. So I think to do that, people do need to have a grounded physical life, a healthy social life, some type of dharma that they love that they feel inspired to follow. And then, of course, obviously, I think that the health of the body is key. People need to be physically healthy. That's a fundamental concept in occult studies, is that if people can't control their weight, if they can't control their sweet tooth, how are they going to control a clephotic entity? It's a fundamental idea, right? So I think that we have to see all these domains of consciousness, and so we have to balance the flesh, the mind. So I think if someone needs therapy and they find psychology interesting, that's very important. But we just shouldn't confuse the two. There's psychology, and then there's occultism. And then, of course, we have some bleed-overs between the two. But I think we can finish that idea by saying if anyone who spends any time truly looking at the work of Carl Jung, you're going to see very quickly that he was not an armchair therapist. It was very weird. And even we know for a fact that the majority of the Jungian Association has fought to suppress so much of that from coming out. They don't want that out. They didn't want the Red Book out. They didn't want any of these things out because they want a certain kind of safe space in psychology. So there's no different in other things. So I think it's all about, I think if people want to work in occultism and they want to work about communicating with other intelligences, they need to have a concerted effort to balance all aspects of their life. They need to be sure that they're not pursuing that to escape something. They need to be sure that they're not doing that because they feel horrible about themselves and they think if they do that, they're going to be a better person. It should just be basically for personal self-transformation. One of the things which I think a good analogy that I'll end with is I often tell people, no one should go to medical school to heal themselves. I see that a lot, and particularly with integrative medicine, or what people sometimes call alternative medicine, is people are going to study because they kind of want to fix themselves. That's a very slippery slope. And as I think if you go into medicine, you should want to go into medicine to help others. That's a fundamental idea, because going to medical school is very hard. You're probably going to make yourself sick going to medical school. That's the thing. So you're not going to get healthy, right? But so I think with occultism, we shouldn't go into occultism trying to make ourselves better out of lack. We should go into occultism to radically explore very strange experiences and grow. And that growth is going to come through tension, an alchemical tension. So that's a totally different growth than if you're just growing by going to getting your bachelor's degree or PhDs, so I hope people can see that occultism is just, they shouldn't look for money in occultism. They shouldn't look for relationship in occultism. Like you just said, they can do that any day.
To that point, Craig, one of the things that I really enjoyed about your book is, and one of the surprising things too, is, one of the first few pages, there are Bible verses,
Yes.
I'd love to talk about this because I think for many people who might work in the Grimoire tradition, obviously they are familiar with terms like the Mass, and they are familiar with terms like apostolic succession. And you employ both of these terms in the book. Can you just kind of lay out, Craig, for listeners, like some of these terms in terms of what is apostolic succession as it's employed in the book, and also the Mass? Can you talk about that?
That's a big influence from my youth, because when I was growing up in Louisiana, even in the spiritualist church, and actually some of the people who were within the spiritual church were Haitian, and their representation of Christianity was very weird. It definitely wasn't what most people would think of were Christian, but they would use the Psalms particularly. That was very influential to me. And then they would often talk about the blessings of Melchizedek. And that was a very big influence on me as a child. And so I think that's something we need to understand, that the apostolic succession in perspective of pagan sacramental Gnosticism, of course, is tied into what a Christian would call descendants of Christ, but it goes back further than that. It goes way, way back to what we would talk about, what I refer to in the Cult of Golgotha as the Melchizedek continuum, which is some ancient transmission of knowledge, which in my personal opinion is definitely tied to the rishis in India. Even the word Anjarasha rishis, which is where we get the word angels or angelos, comes from that. So I think that's the Melchizedek continuum is very much related to how the rishis, the seers, were transmitting something, and that was going through. It kind of came down through every system from there. And so it's like, who baptized John the Baptist? So we need to look and see where this came from. And Jesus didn't invent the Mass. Something that was going on before that. There was definitely a pagan type of sacred meal which was going on way before that. So my work within the apostolic succession is I've often referred to as heretical, because in the sense I'm not Christian, but I definitely use the apostolic succession as a type of magical continuum to feed off of the work. And then I believe that the sacraments are much more ancient than the Christian church, obviously, and ties it back to a type of pagan sacramental Gnosticism. So to me, the sacraments are ancient symbols of the transformation of the flesh and the alchemy of the mind and the body, and its ability to communicate with entities from other dimensions, other levels of reality, and how if we interact with that reality and ground them in this dimension, there can be radical transformation going on. That's even why I use the word Golgotha, is that there's this type of the skull, the hill of the skull is this place where there's a doorway between life and death. Other dimensions, what I refer to as the ambient dead, is around us all the time.
Can you just kind of elaborate, Craig, in terms of when in Cult of Golgotha, what is death and what is the meaning of death, and how is that meaning different from, say, the usual very binary thinking way of there's life and then there's death and these two things are separate? Can you just kind of elaborate on that?
That dichotomy of life and death is very similar to the dichotomy of the flesh and transcendence ideas in Gnosticism, right? It's very similar. The idea that if we have to escape this flesh, that's the only way we can evolve. But the idea that we have to somehow, once death happens, everything is over. That's a very secular humanist idea, right? That the only thing we have is this one life. When death comes, our culture is completely uncomfortable with death. We can see that. We don't want to see it. We don't want to talk about it. And it's a very mysterious thing. And death is supposed to be mysterious. There's a Sanskrit word called abhinavesha. It's a type of death drive that's in the body that everyone, when they die, will have a moment of fear. It's just built into the body. They would say even the greatest saints would have abhinavesha, which means right at the moment of death, because the physical body is meant to live. We have a will to live. We'll fight to live. That's how it goes. So death is a very mysterious and frightening concept to the limited ego. But if we move outside of an egoic consciousness and start to look at a much broader, much more radical, expanded level of awareness, we see that death is basically, it's both a doorway, it's also a wormhole, it's also a gateway into another dimension of reality. And also, too, that it's not so separate. These dimensions there's a perichoresis, right? There's an interpenetration of these things happening. And this is very much mirrored into the movement of the Ida and the Pingala through the Sushumna. They cross back and forth, and there's moments of conjunction. And this is how we have this in our life. And so oftentimes the realm of the dead, even in Louisiana and the Theosophical and the spiritualist churches, the dead were constantly in communication with us. So after a while, I started to call it the ambient dead. It was something which is always around us. I'm a huge, huge fan of ambient music. Brian Eno, Steve Roach, all these pioneers of ambient music. And the idea was this music was so low we could almost barely hear it, but it was always around us. And so the ambient dead are these types of intelligences and spirits, of course, ancestors. They're always around us. We just don't always feel it or see it because our consciousness is so hardened. It's so limited in what we can see. And once we start to seek to expand that, then of course we can see more. And that's actually really connected to the idea of sacramental vision and entering the desert. That once we do transform our limited vision, then we start to see all these other levels of reality, which is, of course, William Blake's writings are very important for that as well, too.
Oh, yeah. Cleansing the doors of perception, for sure.
Exactly. Through our interaction, through our occult work, through interaction with other types of levels of reality, hopefully the person can break their egoic structures, their limited consciousness can expand. And it's very important that, once again, just as we don't need to escape the flesh, we don't need to escape the ego. The ego is just as important as the flesh. It just has to be in the right balance, in the right place. The ego is very, very important. It's a self-defining principle. If someone's ego is damaged, there's going to be a lot of psychological and emotional problems.
That concept, just like the standard definition of Gnosticism, might put some people off because they might say, wait a second, isn't the whole goal of spirituality, let's just use that term very broadly, to eliminate the ego and to transcend?
To kill the ego. That's a very important idea to discuss, is that, yes, eventually we do want to rise above the limited structures of the ego, just like eventually our physical body will die, of course. And so our limited ego will eventually, when the physical body dies, according to these Eastern traditions, the ego also, too, will dissolve. what's left after that? That's the thing. So, but the ego also is a self-defining principle that allows our body to function, to hold the consciousness together, to create a certain understanding of where we are in this world, how we function in different levels of reality. So the ego is it should just be balanced. And actually, in many magical work, the ego should be dramatically expanded. It becomes a type of magical ego where you want to control things and explore things. And so that goes off even to another rabbit hole with that one too. But I think that idea of the ego, the health of the ego, the balanced ego, is directly proportional to why someone's getting involved in occultism. If someone's getting involved in occultism out of a lack, out of a desperation, then their ego is out of balance. If they're getting involved in occultism just because they genuinely have an interest, or they had some strange experiences and they need to explore that, that's a much better way than just to seeking mundane power because they feel like they don't have it, something like that. So,
yeah, that's a great point. In fact, I'm really glad you brought that up, Craig, because that ties into something that I jotted down on page 149, where you say, quote, "The relationship of the physical body, esoteric penetrations, and the cosmic is of prime importance within the magical work of the cult of Golgotha." And can you just talk about that in terms of, this is under the chapter about talking about Gnostic lycanthropy, and can you kind of talk about that in terms of the interweaving of those three forces, and also this concept of like cyclicism, about really being sensitive to cycles and time? Yes. Can you touch on that?
The idea of Gnostic lycanthropy was the idea that the cycles of the moon are intimately related to how our nervous system works and how our brain, the hemispheres of our brain, work. And so different phases of the moon that we're able to access different parts of our brain, different parts of our nervous system. And in Tantra, this was referred to as the kalas, and different kind of types of goddesses could be communicated with at different levels of that. And so to me, that's very important on that level, but it's also very important for us to understand that the phases of the moon can be very representation of the phases of our life. Phases of our lifetime as we go through it, the phases of our day, for us to be more aware of how we're always constantly waxing and waning in life. We're always constantly changing and morphing and changing, and that's just part of the process. And just like our body is constantly rebuilding, our body, our cells are constantly dying and rebuilding. Our blood is constantly dying and rebuilding. So is our spiritual. So is our ego. So is our spiritual experiences. But the ego actually sustains this kind of constant thread of awareness through all that. That's something that I wanted to kind of adumbrate with that chapter and talk about. And then there's also some very strange occult things that are going on with the moon, that are going on with Saturn and the communication with Saturn and the moon, and even Saturn's moons. So I wanted to mention that in the book as well too. And then in this magical system that I use with Esoteric Vunon, there's specific contacts with those levels of reality. So we work with that. That's related to ideas in Vedic sciences where they talked about at the time of death, the soul would go through two pathways. One they would call the Devayana, which was the pathway to the gods, which was hopefully some type of pathways to self-realization, basically, essentially. The person was realizing they weren't a limited being. They were connected to their soul, their Atman. But other people, if they were still limited in their structure, they would go to the Pitrayana, which would mean the path of the fathers, or the path of the ancestors. It was very mysterious, and they would talk about that path would go to the moon. The Devayana would go to the sun, solar realm. The Pitrayana, the path of fathers, would go to the moon, and then you would just be food for the moon. You'd just be recycled and then go back into the cycle of rebirth, samsara, back into that. And so I think that is where you get a lot of the ideas of these ancient Gnostic texts talking about like escaping the archons at the moment of death, and understanding that each planetary level you had to have a password or a key to get through. These were kind of like artifacts of these ancient Vedic ideas of that there's definitely some type of, if the person has not deeply worked on their spiritual self, and that's a Buddhist idea too, that eventually at the moment of death they just kind of dissolve. And that's a very, frightening concept to most people, that, people like to think, no, I'll remember who I am. But most people, if they haven't done significant spiritual work at the moment of their death, they will dissolve into nothingness. Their ego is dissolved. That's what we talk about nirvana. There's like an extinguishing. Something else comes back, but whether or not the idea, if they can remember who they are, then of course the transformation is more powerful. So the Gnostic lycanthropy is kind of working with those strange energies, understanding the cycles, and also too particularly how the cycles affect our physical body. How they affect, like, for example, the secretion of melatonin at night, the secretion of cortisol during the day, how we can use specific herbal essences, Ayurvedic medicine, to harmonize the body so that we're not as affected by that. And also, too, the moon is a very important symbol of the emotional realm and how people are manipulated via their emotions. And Gnostic lycanthropy is about realizing that the emotions are essentially Maya. That the world is Maya too, but the emotions are also just like a dance. They're just a waxing and a waning. They're very effective for us to learn experiences, but they shouldn't control us.
You talk about in the book, Craig, things like also, quantum Voodoo, for example. Can you just share with listeners about that? Because I think like most listeners might be familiar on the kind of basic level with, the grand unified field theory, string theory, non-locality. But can you elaborate on the specific use of quantum in Cult of Golgotha?
Yeah, that's a big thing. I mean, I think that I've always been fascinated with the ideas of quantum physics. And then, of course, when I became close friends with Reginald Crosley, who wrote The Voodoo Quantum Leap, obviously that book, which I think everyone should examine, discusses extensively how he was showing how his experiences with Haitian Voodoo had distinct correlates to the modern revelations in quantum science, quantum physics. However, I think quantum physics has been just abused and bastardized in New Age systems. It just becomes an excuse to say everything's the same and everything's fine. So I think we have to really study quantum physics closely before we apply them. But there are some very important ideas within that. I talked about those ideas in the book. I almost refer to as a quantum Vodon or quantum Vodon, which is based on the boson particle, which is very important to me, and how Hinduism was tied to that. And so I think that was my own creative expression of that, just like Michael Berter asked me to show my own personal expression of this. And so that was like an example of how I will take this into the future, how people could potentially do that. And so I think that idea of quantum physics just should broaden our levels of reality. For example, I'm a medical practitioner, and so I find quantum ideas of medicine and healing very important. However, if someone comes to me with a strep throat, I don't start lecturing them on quantum physics. I'll probably give them some distinct things which will help their Newtonian body very quickly. So, because we still live in a Newtonian universe, but we also have a quantum universe, and that's kind of back and forth, this interpenetration of these different levels of reality. That's what I think people need to be aware of. Just because someone believes in quantum physics doesn't mean they give up Newtonian physics, but it just means there's different levels of reality. And then we have a responsibility to educate ourselves on those levels if we want to throw those words around, use those words. But I think that the research levels in quantum physics and the occultism has a lot of potential if it's done in an educated manner.
I think it's so easy nowadays, especially with this kind of new age thinking, for people to just vaguely rattle off things about quantum physics, like we're all just vibrational, multidimensional spheres of light interpenetrating the non-locality. I mean, you can go on. It's just so easy to do, and that's what was so refreshing about your book, because you were employing a very specific use about, look, this is, especially when it comes to confronting things like head on, attacking this kind of bipolar, false dichotomy thinking, and really embracing the terrestrial roots, but also looking at this unique contact with beings outside of ourselves. I mean, that was a very specific use.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing we have to look at, is like we have to look at quantum physics as a challenge to us to expand the limitations of our awareness and to just be open to new explorations, to new experiments. But while we're doing that, we have to be very well aware of the environment that we're around it. Just like you might want to contact other levels of awareness, but you have a traditional system which gives you guidelines and rules on how to do that. Of course, you still want to follow those, and then eventually maybe you would experiment a little bit more, but you just wouldn't give up all of your own system and rules to do that. And so I think we can see that now. But of course, that is also reflective of this huge dichotomy in science of like religion or spirituality and science. Of course, that's created a lot of damage. So hopefully in our lifetime, we'll see at least these discussions happening more. And we can find some bridges between the two.
Now that this book has been, really revealed as a continuum of your previous two books as well, I mean, how does this flow into continuing the work for you and continuing the projects and continuing the engagement?
Yeah, that's an important idea. The idea to me that these things are not static, they're always evolving, which is the idea of Agni, or the sacred flame. It's always morphing, it's always changing, we're always changing. So to me, it's very important for me to continue this work, to always continue to explore it. The Cult of Golgotha is one part of a larger, Gnostic group, which I call the Ecclesia Gnostica Nigra, which is a type of sacramental body which I formed to explore specific aspects of Michael Bertrow's system, which we would call Gnostic. And I work with specific individuals, and we've kind of worked to continue to broaden that. And so I'll write further books about this material outside of just this. The next book I'll write will definitely, or that we'll publish, will be Tantric Physics 2, Sacred Body, Sacred Space. That'll give people a little bit more foundational ideas about what Tantra is, how it's used within these esoteric systems. But I think that we have a responsibility to always continually create. There's this weird idea in occultism that you'll meet people that they kind of act like they're just done, like they're just kind of finished. I don't trust anyone who doesn't have a teacher, no matter how old they get, and I don't trust anyone who doesn't continually create, because eventually they're just going to. It's like a musician who just doesn't write any songs anymore. Like, I've just wrote all the songs I have. That's it. I mean, I guess that could happen, but that seems really weird. That would be a strange thing to do, So I was always inspired by people who were just constantly creating, constantly pushing the boundaries. I wanted this book to just kind of show that. And so for me, I'm always continuing these explorations. My life is always an exploration of both the physical challenges of life, spiritual challenges of life, all those things going on. To me, my occult work will continue on in this lifetime and then lifetimes beyond. I think the idea of a quantum time is beyond what most people could conceive, and that we're probably living in different dimensions right now at one time anyway.
We exist in a three-dimensional universe. The fourth dimension layered on top of that is time, but we only experience time in a linear fashion. But if we could see the whole dimension, we would see every, from the moment we're born until death and beyond that. I mean, beyond those conceptions.
Yeah, exactly. So I try to just push those boundaries with that. And to me, the magical work is very inspiring. It just inspires me. Also, too, another thing that I would say is that my magical work, my occult work, makes me love the mundane world even more. It really inspires me to embrace life, to appreciate the ephemeral experiences we have in life, that time just goes by so quickly. I recently had a birthday, and it's a bit mind-boggling to me to think about that, because it just seems like yesterday that I was a certain age. And so my magical work for me just makes me appreciate each moment more. It's not an escapism, and it's actually an embracing. It's an immersion in everyday reality, and I think that's an important thing that people can forget, for sure.
When it comes to this book, The Cult of Golgotha, where do you want readers to go right after they've really absorbed it and spent some time with it?
I put a lot of footnotes in the book that were very important. The footnotes are keys to unlocking a lot of doorways within the book. I hope that when people read The Cult of Golgotha, that they are inspired to look back over their own spiritual journeys and do their own type of Gnostic nostalgia and see what has influenced them see what's built them up, see what's made them who they are, and then ask themselves, what do they truly want from their occultism? And then I hope that it makes them be radically creative and to explore and push the boundaries, and don't let someone tell them what they can and can't do with their occultism. So I think there needs to be a little bit more. Sure, there needs to be some recklessness in there too. That's how we're going to find some interesting things. But hopefully it makes people just excited to explore things, and that it breaks them out of their kind of strange secular humanist thing that I see happening in occultism now, where everything's just turned into this weird, dry psychology. And so I hope that it inspires people to break out a little bit of that as well too. And those are grand desires. I don't know if that'll happen, but that was what I was thinking about when I was writing the book.
Where would you like listeners, if they have more information, obviously Anathema Publishing, they can pick up a copy of Cult of Golgotha, Entering the Desert. But if listeners, hear this and they want to find out more, they want to reach out to you, where can they find you? What else would you like them to know? I'm
dangerously easy to find. Right in this modern world we live in right now. So if anyone has any questions, I really enjoy engaging with people. I enjoy talking with people, and so I'm fairly easy to access. And so if anyone reads the book and is inspired or has any questions, they can always contact me through. Obviously, they can go to my website, which is Ayurveda Austin. They could Google Craig Williams Acupuncture, Craig Williams Golgotha, and find me. Obviously, through the regular social media outlets which we use today to communicate, Facebook and Instagram and things like that. And so I think that's a good thing. I don't take students at all, but I have a private group that I work with, and we do our own creative work, and that'll be revealed in time. We'll do more of that. But I always love meeting like minds and helping people find the tools they need to grow. That's one of the problems, I think, with occultism now, is people put up a lot of bullshit secrecy things, and they just don't help people. These like pseudo hierophants will guide people along, and they'll kind of give people little crumbs here and there, hoping that. And so I totally am in complete opposition to that. I think that's actually a counter initiation. I think we have more counter initiations happening in occultism than we do have true valid initiations. And so I'm always open to helping people find the tools they need, get the right resources, anytime with that type of thing. So I'm glad you asked that.
Is there anything else that we haven't touched on yet regarding the Cult of Golgotha that you want to let listeners know about, or is there any other parting advice or tips or wisdom?
No, I hope that the work inspires people to explore many of the ideas within the book. I hope the book pays homage to very important teachers that I reference in the book, that people will look at those teachers and kind of re-examine their work. Also, too, I'm very happy that the Entering the Desert is out in a paperback now, so that people have access to that. There's a unique kind of cross-pollination between Entering the Desert and Cult of Golgotha. And once people read those two books, the two books transform and morph back and forth. So I would encourage people to examine both of those as well, too. And then I'm very excited to be releasing Tantric Physics Volume 2 in 2019, and that'll have a re-release of Cave of the Numinous with it, because Cave of the Numinous is sold out. So we'll have Volume 1 and Volume 2 together in one book. That's very exciting as well, too, as well as future works on all the material that I've written in Golgotha. So there's not enough time to write everything I want to write, but I promise there's a lot of exciting stuff coming. So I appreciate all the amazing feedback I get from readers, too. I'm very humbled by that as well.
Craig Williams, the latest book is Cult of Golgotha. Thank you so much, Craig, just for taking the time and coming back on the podcast today.
It's an honor. Thanks so much.
Thanks, as always, listeners, goes directly to you for taking the time to enjoy the podcast. And in the meantime, you can always subscribe and check out previous episodes and other magical Glitch Bottle news on YouTube. That's youtube.com/glitchbottle. And if you subscribe, you can make sure to hit that little notification bell if you'd like for new episodes as soon as they post on YouTube. You can also follow us on Twitter at glitchbottle, all one word. And you can definitely download and listen to podcast episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Stitcher Radio. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.